tried that out yet. I'm too scared. Professor Mason, welcome to the Astroben podcast. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
No, the pleasure is definitely all mine. I first heard about you on the Lex Friedman podcast. He's one of my favorite podcast hosts. Um, I'm obviously no way near him in terms of interview skills or even how I dress. I mean, I'm just sitting here in a polo shirt, but but yeah, I loved you on Lex. And
Thanks. Thanks.
here on the Astroben podcast, we're all about space, obviously. Um,
hmm hmm
so I'd love to dive straight in if that's okay, and
Yeah,
talk
so
about
great. Yeah.
the Mason Laboratory. So why
hmm
don't you tell me and my audience a bit about the Mason Laboratory, um, and how the idea came about, and what is your mission?
Yeah, happy to. So the laboratory I have is one we set up at Cornell at the medical school called Weill Cornell Medicine. And it's a genetics laboratory, but really focuses on genetics, not just inside of a human or even on the body of humans, looking at microbes, for example. But we really want to think about this an integrated view of all the genetics of all creatures in, on, and around us, including human cells and microbial cells, but how we can understand them when things go wrong in terms of, say, diseases like cancer, which we focus on, and where infectious diseases can even lead to cancer, and computational methods to understand them, but then bring all these tools that we use at the hospital and have bring them to bear and to use them for keeping astronauts space for really long-term space flight. And so some of the examples there have been the Mark and Scott Kelly, who were the twins, where one twin went into space for a year and the other one stayed on Earth, and we're replicating some of those same protocols for other astronauts. But we really want to, I'm a geneticist by training, and the laboratory I built is mixture of computational people as well as people that work at the bench and specialists in aerospace medicine and cancer biology and cell biology, but all of them come together to really understand what happens to the body when it's in really stressful situations like a severe disease or a space flight. Both of them can be extremely stressful on the body, and in some cases, the body wonderfully adapts and can respond quickly. In other cases, for example, in disease like cancer, it can be too much for the body to take on its own. So we also do some synthetic biology. So figuring out ways to make new kinds of cells or new functions of cells. Sometimes we borrow from microbes or from tardigrades and try and actually think about ways to do what's called synthetic biology, where you actually build new components of biology and really bring those lessons to bear for long-term missions even to other planets. So that's it in a nutshell.
It's a very interesting nutshell. There's a lot to unpack there. I want to hear. I want to know about all of it.
Yeah,
But let's go on the twin study to start with, because I was
sure.
aware of that. I read Scott Kelly's book, so I know quite a lot from Scott Kelly's point of view, but I don't really know anything about what happened to Mark. And so, how did that experiment came about? Were you speaking to NASA anyway about an experiment you'd like to do, and they were like, "Hey, we actually have a set of twins that are both in the astronaut cohort," and it sort of worked out? Or who approached who to come up with that idea? Because it just captures the imagination.
Yeah, the original idea of doing this idea of a complete genetic and immunological and microbiome profile of the astronauts, I'd sent a proposal to NASA in 2010 to start this conversation, but they didn't have samples banked that could satisfy the goals of the study, and they didn't have any immediate plans for a mission. But then John Charles, the director of the program, said, "Well, stay tuned. We're still talking about missions that would use some of these methods, these molecular tools to understand the body's response to spaceflight, but they hadn't done it yet." So, but then actually it was, when they announced this, what's called the year-long mission, where Russia also had a cosmonaut stay for a year, and Scott was planning. They were starting to plan it and had at a press conference, and then actually one of the reporters said, "Hey, don't you have a twin? Are you guys going to do anything with that?" And it was actually Scott and Mark Kelly themselves who said, actually maybe we should do something with that. So they approached NASA and said, listen, we're twins. Maybe we should do something here and have some of the same, basically, blood, saliva, stool, urine, all the same collections we do from Scott in space, do it for Mark on Earth. And so they it actually came from the astronauts themselves to say, what if we did this? And at first NASA said, well, this it's only two people. How much can we learn? We don't know if this will be viewed as like too gimmicky. But then, the more they thought about it, they said, well, when else are we going to have really identical twins we could study? And when they're both, game for it and ready to have samples collected. So it was really off the cuff remark that came up at a press conference that then led to, oh, we should really do this. So then they put out calls for applications. and we were one of the teams selected to help lead the mission, especially on the genetic side, of course. And so yeah, it was fun because a lot of the same people I'd been talking about in the years before the announcement were the same people who I got to work with on the mission, who originally said, "Well, we don't have any samples yet, but hang in there." And yeah, so then we launched it in 2014 and went up in space for a year and did everything we could measure about the body before, during, and after spaceflight. We did.
That's so cool. Did you plan out the entire year, or did you have some sort of key experiments that you wanted to do, and as time went on, kind of new ideas would come to the table? Like how many of the experiments were planned out, and how many were late additions?
Yeah, well, we had to finalize everything for the flight because the flight operations has to send up supplies, and you only have so many launches. So we had to really lock down everything for the protocols for the full year because for consistency and reproducibility of an experiment, you want to use the same protocol, same methods, same reagents and supplies. So we really had to lock everything down for what we were going to collect and process for the mission.
Hmm.
But actually, the great thing is, even though we had other ideas and new technologies that emerged, we actually have more recently a chance to do that with SpaceX and Axiom and other agencies to actually, bring this for commercial spaceflight. So a lot of the same protocols we developed for NASA that we're still using there, we can now actually deploy these also for commercial spaceflight, which is, like, for example, we wanted to look at what happens in the blood and certain genes get turned on and get turned off. So it's kind of gene expression changes, and this is normal. Your body, when you're ever changing what you eat, or if you're going for a run, you'll have a dynamic change where your genes will be regulated and turn up, down, off, on. And so this is normal, but we wanted to do this from blood, and we did it with bulk blood. So we looked basically at all of the blood together and sort of some sorted cells. But what we can do now is what's called single cell sequencing. You can take a blood sample and you can look at, tens of thousands or even millions of cells, each cell at a time. So you don't have to actually grind up all the cells and look in aggregate. We can go basically cell by cell to look at the response of every kind of cell in the body to the changes in gravity and stress and radiation. So that's been something we wish we could have done for the twin study, but now we can do for these future missions and current missions.
What was the most surprising result from the study? And are you still evaluating? Are you still doing tests on them to this day?
Yes, we still do an annual blood draw and some profiling of the astronauts as well as the other astronauts we've profiled. And we do this actually for, it's actually got more complicated because now Mark Kelly is a senator, so we have to get blood through the Secret Service and have to get approval. So it's usually difficult to go get blood from a senator, but we found a way, just a little bit of paperwork. But we do annual blood draws, really as a lifetime surveillance assessment of their health, really to see, again, NASA does a bit of this as well, but we want to see, are any of the changes that were observed during spaceflight, have they all returned to normal? Are any of them persisting? And there's to your question of the surprises, there's been a few things. One was really surprising is that his telomeres got longer in space, which we worked with Susan Bailey on that, and then validated that in our lab and used different methods to confirm that. And we see this also for other astronauts who've flown. So it's really a unique aspect of spaceflight. That revolves a lot around changes in blood cell distribution, but we see that consistently. We did also see that his body, some things, because we all get mutations, but some of the mutations that he had in space actually got a little bit better, but then they came back bigger than before when he got back. So an analogy is kind of like when you have a mole on your skin. If you have a little freckle that becomes a mole, it's not necessarily a problem unless it gets big and changes color or shape. And we can see that in the blood too. You can see mutations in the blood,
Mm.
that come and then they go. But as we all get mutations as we age, of course. But his Scott's mutations got a little bit better when he was actually in space. But then they came back more aggressively when he got back to Earth. And so we think, what is this sort of long-term risk for what's called clonal hematopoiesis, which just means hematopoiesis means the genesis of your blood, and clonal means, of course, one clone is kind of winning and taking over. We've been keeping an eye on that in particular because it's an indicator for cardiovascular health and also risk of leukemia. So we keep an eye on that every year, kind of like yeah, if any of you go to a dermatologist once every year or two to check on your moles, it's very similar, just doing it at the genetic level to look for any
Mm.
mutations that were from space or even exacerbated by space.
And you mentioned that.
I'd say the big
Uh,
surprise was that it got better in space. Oh, sorry, yeah, the big surprise was that we thought it would get worse in space, but it actually got better.
so when you say his telomeres got longer, what does that mean? Because I don't really understand what they are, if I'm being honest.
Yes, yeah, I guess I jump into some genetics jargon right away, but the telomeres. So imagine if if the DNA, of course, is the recipe for making all the cells in your body. It's kind of like a recipe book you might have in your kitchen, and the letters inside are the genetic code, the A, C, G, and T. But at the end of the book, or you have these essentially the cover of the book, the front and back cover really keeps the entire book's contents contained and intact. And so the spine of the book and the front and back cover are very much analogous to what happens in your cells. Is that all of your DNA is packaged in your cells in the nucleus, and then at the very ends of each one of your chromosomes, which contain your DNA, you get half from your mom and half from your dad. At the end of those chromosomes are called the telomeres. It's this repeated section of your DNA that is kind of like the front and back cover of your book of life. And it normally shrinks over time because this is just a progress of aging, and that we see this continuously. But what's interesting is, the only times it can really get longer is if you have a really dramatic change in your lifestyle. Like if you really start exercising more, living a generally healthier lifestyle, that can
Mm.
sometimes make it on average longer. But if you're doing more smoking, more say stressful conditions on the body, or even potentially environmental stressors, can make it shrink faster. But in all of us, it shrinks every year as we age, and so it means kind of the edges of your book of life get frayed over time. And so the telomeres are these protective elements in your genetic code. And since they normally shrink as you age, we thought that that would just continue or even accelerate in space. But actually, the opposite happened. They got longer, which is a result almost no one believed at first. But then, after multiple studies and validation work between my lab and Susan Bailey's lab and several others, it's definitely real and confirmed now 5 different ways. And it does seem to be a change in the proportion of cells in the blood, and also a little bit of a low dose radiation is kind of, it's almost like cleaning away the dead cells that were, or the the cells that were about to die, and this kind of nudges them over the edge. And also the changes in blood cell proportions. Also, you get a lot of new blood that's forming in space as your body responds, and that also are their younger cells. So we see it's all these things together. We think are contributing to that.
Wow. I mean, it sounds like there could be some really serious positive discoveries that come off these sort of experiments. Um, and I'm not going to pretend I understand exactly, how it all works, but it's pretty inspiring. So, how are you working with
Oh, I think I
private
lost you there.
companies like SpaceX and
Mhm.
Axiom? Um, and
Oh,
how? Sorry, I think you cut off a little bit there. Um, can you hear me? Okay.
may have lost you there, Ben. Maybe it's a connection issue.
Hey, Chris, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Oh, there we go. Yes, I think it died there for a second. I was just checking. Can you hear
So
me okay?
annoying. Yeah, loud and clear. Sorry, I can edit it
Okay.
all out. It's not the end of the world. So you mentioned you were
No
working
problem. Do you
with.
wanna? You've got the recording. Or is it
Yeah,
still there?
yeah,
I think, right? Is it?
it's just restarted. Yeah. Um,
Okay.
let's just go straight back in. Um,
Okay.
so you mentioned you're working with private companies now, like SpaceX and Axiom. How does that how does that differ? Because when you start looking at private astronauts, you can imagine they might not be as uh, physically, mentally as fit and well rounded as someone like Scott Kelly. So how do you expect quote unquote normal people to react when they're in space for an extended period of time?
Yeah. So I mean, this is one of the biggest questions we have, of course, for the work is you're going to the what are sort of more regular people, if you will, though they're all pretty extraordinarily interesting people and have usually some background in either, aerospace work or medicine or space flight. But the Inspiration 4 mission, for example, was the first all-civilian crew that had no prior NASA training or astronaut training, and was a privately funded mission, and they also crammed in a lot of experiments and work to do in space. So they didn't just go up there and hang out for a few days. And so we were in the middle of analyzing and finalizing work on a lot of the data we collected, really replicating a lot of the work in the twin study with this crew and subsequent crews that will do it continuously. Actually, I'm flying out to Hawthorne to do a briefing very soon. And Hawthorne's where SpaceX headquarters is. The interesting thing is so far the data we've seen is that the body again is very plastic and can respond in a really adept way to changes in temperature, pressure, gravity. Really, it responds, and it can be confusing for the body. And signatures of the immune system are upregulated, and you can see the cells trying to repair the DNA damage that they're getting. You can see them, really responding to the stress in many ways. But then they return quite quickly back to normal. So we've seen this for the commercial crews, which includes the first prosthetic limb from Haley Arsenault was up in
Mm.
space, and she's a cancer survivor. She had bone cancer, right? So that's a first, and see that it was just fine, right? So they all have really recovered well, and also contributed a lot of experimental data to our work and to others to help not just go up there but bring a lot of experiments, and this includes ultrasounds in space, doing a lot of the genomics work I just described, like the immune system and telomere work, and what changes in the genes and how they're regulated, and also some immune assays. So we're doing a lot of work with the crews, and it's been really collaborative and wonderful, actually. So really working directly with them has been a pleasure.
So fascinating because I think with private space companies, they seem to sort of grab the media attention of the press. It's all about the rockets and the who's going to get to Mars first and all that kind of thing. But the human spaceflight experience, that's the thing that's going to make or break these missions because the technology is going to be there. It's probably there already to go back to the moon and onto Mars. How far away are we from
Yes.
being able to look after humans? So to get them, we know we can get humans to the moon and back safely, but what about to Mars? If we technologically could do it tomorrow, would we be able to ensure that when they return, they're not going to die of an overdose of radiation or something like that?
Yeah, yeah. There's concerns about this because if say it's because the mission to Mars is usually about 5 to 6 months. You have to basically get there and turn around immediately. It would take you maybe 8 months to get back, or you could stay until the orbital sort of velocities of the planets realign, and then you could have, since the proximity gets better, so then you could launch back again towards Earth. But that would be a 3-year mission, and both missions have been discussed and proposed and are under discussion. But for example, going up in space for a year led to radiation for Scott Kelly, and that was about what's called a millisievert, is a measure of radiation exposure. He got 146 millisieverts during that year in space, and that's pretty close to Earth still. That's within the Van Allen belts, which has this
Mm.
protective magnetosphere around Earth. And then, but if you look at a Mars mission that might be 3 years, that would be approximately 1,200 millisieverts. So almost 10 times the amount of radiation, and then would already put the astronaut, basically into you've exceeded your lifetime limit of radiation. So you could go on one mission and then you'd have to just be grounded. But we've never quite done it before, right? So there's a lot of discussion and debate and uncertainty about exactly what is the real limit of safety for radiation exposure in space, because it's slightly different radiation. It's not the same as, say, just some radiation on Earth, or being even in a nuclear reactor, or being a worker there. It's cosmic rays. It's much more heavier atoms that are bombarding your body. So this is we know definitely probably you could probably go once. I don't think you'll start to see people go 4 or 5 times back to Mars. It would probably be too much radiation from what we know today. So what
So
we'll
that,
do is when they get back, there'll be a lot of the same metrics we're doing now as you measure how their bodies are scrambled, do a lot of blood work, look at what's called biodosimetry,
mm.
which is the body's response to radiation. Because dosimetry is the measure of radiation and how much you get, and the biodosimetry is, can we see the body's response, the signatures of how the body is repairing itself or reacting to different radiation. So we can actually quite well and exquisitely well measure that at a genetic level now, and that's what we're doing for the current crews, and we'll do that for the future Martian astronauts if all goes well.
So do you have sort of longer term contracts with NASA and companies like SpaceX?
Yeah,
how do
some of them are span. Yeah, yeah. Some of them are for a few years, like 3 or 4 years, but some of the other missions, like the Cypher missions, are going to go for the next 8 to 10 years, because they will, we want to really have this be a lifetime, surveillance effort. So that's something that we're
mm,
planning, essentially has been launched for all of the commercial cruises. They get, the benefit of having a lifetime tracking and surveillance of their health and monitoring. Again, because maybe it's not as bad as we think. Maybe the body will be just fine, but it's really a new environment that we're sending humans into that we don't know a lot about. So we want to really give them the opportunity to be monitored to make sure they're as safe and supported as possible.
so interesting. Well, tell me about your 10 phase 500-year plan, because it's kind of mind-boggling. Like the human brain can't really comprehend more than a sort of 100-year period, basically one's own life. So what's your thinking in terms of a 500-year plan? What if you could summarize what that concept is?
Sure. So I actually just wrote a book about this. It's called, appropriately, The Next 500 Years, with the subtitles Engineering Life to Reach New World. So I posted this plan for our laboratory about 10 years ago on the lab's website to just say, well, here's what I think we should be doing for the next 500 years. And I actually would push back on the first comment, is that, most people think that they can only maybe look ahead 100 years or their own lifetime. But I actually think a quintessential feature of humans, maybe even one of the defining most human things you can do, is to think beyond your own lifespan, is to basically, think about what seeds you could plant in a garden of the future that you'll never see germinate,
Mm,
but that will contribute to something long after you're dead. Is a quintessentially human trait, and no other species does this. We know that, other animals build nests for their young, but there's no other animals building nests for their, 4 or 5 generations ahead. But we can and do this as a species. So I actually think it's something everyone discounts themselves too much. They think, well, I just think mostly about my life or my day or my job or what I'm going to do tomorrow. But just that simple act of planning ahead, it's just a question, of scale, not of type. It's not like you have to invent a new kind of way of thinking. You just do it a little bit longer, right? So I actually think it's something everyone can and should do, is to think, well, what could I do that I could build that would last longer, that would contribute towards it? And this has been happening since, people have built cathedrals, whereas multiple generations working to build cathedrals, often under very poor conditions. And back then, a generation was only like 20 years, so it's a little bit
mm.
shorter. But this intergenerational responsibility and project building is something we've done actually for millennia. So I think, but anyway, with that as a backdrop, the 500-year plan was to think, what do we need to know about the human genome, was the first phase, is map everything we can about what's happening in the body, for example, in cancer and spaceflight, and also just build a better map of the human genome, because we didn't have the first draft of the human genome, the Book of Life for Humans, until 2001. It didn't actually technically get finished until just this past year, where we finished all the little tiny gaps that we couldn't fill in. So that's actually work that I talked about 10 years ago that we needed to finish. But then, really, in phase two, is once we finished a lot of the mapping, then we start to do some of the tweaking and engineering of the genome to think about large scale clinical trials. And we've seen this already today, where there's CRISPR trials, people doing modified, essentially cells to treat disease, like sickle cell. We've also seen CRISPR babies be born, where you can modify embryos. He Jiankui did this in China a few years ago, which is very controversial, with good reason. He was put in jail for a while. I think it was a really poorly designed study and not fair to the participants. But phase two is something we started to see. So this tinkering and genome editing. And phase three is when I think we would do this at really large scale. So large scale clinical trials of genome tweaking and engineering, and been near the 2050s and 2060s. Then phase four is, I think, we start to get to really not just visit Mars, but start to have a long-term presence there, and also on the moon, which is what NASA's talked about as well. Then when we get towards, some of the middle phases are more about just getting increments out to farther and farther in our own solar system. So phases 4 and 5 and 6 are getting out towards Mars, and then getting out towards some of the outer planets and Titan. And I have a whole discussion about, could we live on Titan, for example? There's, have ways to process the methane. And then in the later phases, it's more, 7 and 8 is really to prepare what are called the ability to have generation ships, where we could learn enough about other stars to know where there's good exoplanets where we could maybe land on and survive,
Mm.
and then actually pick the best star. And then by the end of phase nine, we launch towards basically a new star. So actually have a generation ship where multiple generations live and die on the same spacecraft on their way towards a new planet, including a wide battery of tools and techniques to modify cells and genomes so that we could survive on those planets when we reach them. including just surviving in space a little bit better,
Mm.
and then actually getting it to where we're at a second sun as a species. And then phase 10 is it gets towards the end of the universe and what happens there, which I think we would try and survive as long as we could, including to the end and maybe prevent the end of the universe, which raises some philosophical questions, but I think that's what we should do.
It sounds like your thinking is, thinking sort of philosophically and, about the future of humanity. It's very closely interlinked with an understanding of who we are on a very small scale. So I was just thinking, like, do you think there's a sort of synergy between setting foot on Mars and then also finding a cure for cancer, that kind of thing? Do you think there's like a humanity's getting to a point where we're going to understand everything so much and suddenly become a multiplanetary species? This sounds exciting.
It's very exciting. We're living in, quantifiably the best day ever in genetics and in biology and medicine. And that's true today, and it's actually true every single day that I wake up. Is there's more data, there's more capacity for discovery, there's a lot more of an ability for us to actually, build new kinds of cells, map their functions, to be able to, tweak them and literally cure disease. Sorry, I'm trying to turn off my phone here. All right,
That's
I
right.
could answer that question again. Sorry, turn off my phone here. Should have done that earlier. The all right, should I start over, you think, in the sentence, or where can you cut it? I don't know.
Uh, no, that's okay. So I
Right.
I was just thinking about the, humanity in the next 500 years. Where do you think we're going to be as a species? You mentioned possibly, certainly on Mars, possibly the moons of Jupiter. Do you think that's where we'll be in 500 years? Well, we'll obviously have probes further afield, but where do you think there'll be physically
Yeah.
humans, possibly with little
This, he-
civilizations?
yeah, with little outposts and really places to stay. And it's a real sign when you can go somewhere and have leisure, like will there be cocktail bars on Mars and things like that? Quite possibly. So I think that's a sign that you can go there and relax, not just go there and survive. So that's, I think, going to be a real metric. Is what has it become commonplace? Has it become, like for 100 years ago, it was crazy to take a plane across an ocean or even just to get on a plane. It was very unusual. And
Mm.
now no one thinks twice about it, right? It's rote, it's routine, it's very simple. And so I think in 200 years, space flight will hopefully become like that. And then you should see us on certainly most of the inner planets. Mercury's a bit hot, but hopefully have some things around Venus and Mars. And then also start to get up to the other outer planets and maybe even certainly have our eyes on different exoplanets that we could go to next. And I think that's where we'll be. Again, in 100 years, we've come extraordinarily far. Give it another few hundred years, it's very reasonable to think we could at least be there and not just survive there, but thrive in some of these other planets.
Have you thought even longer term? Where do you think, if we're still around, where do you think humanity's going to be in 1,000, a million years? Because for me, I can't.
Yeah, I think about
500
this a
years is
lot actually.
500 years is probably the most I can like think of creatively. I can't get past that.
Well, it is. There is. I actually really recommend. There's a book called The Precipice by Toby Ord, which is about what are the existential threats to humanity and what happens in the long, long future. And I talk about this a bit in my book. Is if you look in the very, very far distance, say in billions or trillions of years, it's possible that if the universe keeps expanding, at some point all the other galaxies in the universe will quite literally be beyond our reach, meaning like, but they're still expanding faster and farther away from us. So if you send a signal, it won't even get there or come back to you before they've moved too far apart. So there may even be a time when we're just in our own galaxy for a long time, and that's the closest thing we can see, and we won't see any other galaxies in the sky anymore, which is, terrifying to think about in a way. But it is trillions and trillions of years away. But I think about this because I think, as I describe in the book, is that if we do face that question of, okay, the universe is quite literally tearing itself apart, and it looks like there's not going to be a big crunch where the universe comes back into itself, but it looks like it will just keep expanding, and we're looking at the heat death of the universe. I think there we have a moral obligation to restructure, the universe itself to maybe prevent that from happening, because there's no guarantee that life will arise again in the next universe or again in this universe. And so I think life itself is one of the few things that counteracts entropy and organizes the universe and is precious. I think it's, as far as we know, it's only here, right? It might be elsewhere, but as far as we know, it's just on Earth, and it is extremely rare. So I think it's something that's worth preserving, and that's something I think we should do, even towards the literal end of the facing the end of the universe, is actually to fight against that.
Well, you mentioned assuming we're alone in the universe. Do you think we are?
I think microbially, there's probably some other life forms out there, but this question of are we alone, was often called the Fermi paradox. Is
Mm.
Enrico Fermi was looking at all the stars, and there's trillions and trillions of stars, and his question was just where is everybody? Like, why haven't we been contacted by aliens? Some people say, well, they look at us and it's too sad, so they don't want to reach out because we're too dangerous or too primordial. I actually still just think it's just early. Like the universe has not been around long enough to make a lot of life, but a lot of the fundamental components we keep finding on comets, on asteroids, on other atmospheres of other planets. So I actually think we're just at the beginning of life being created on different planets, and that could also be interesting. It's kind of like the opposite of the prime directive in Star Trek, where your goal is to not interfere with any planet. I
Mm.
think there's a case to be made that maybe we should think about, well, should we interfere? If we can go to a planet and there's primordial life there, but we could nudge it along to get more complex, should we do so? Should we kind of help it become more sentient or complicated or adaptable? I think, maybe not right away, but you could argue, much like on our own planet, if you look far in the future, about 1 or 2 billion years, it'll get so hot the oceans will boil. Any life that's still here will just be murdered by the sun. So if we can go to another planet and see that that sun's going to eventually just engulf the planet, then we kind of have to preserve the life or bring it with us or move it or help nudge it along. Otherwise, it'll go extinct based on its proximity to the sun. So I think there's other moral obligations we have to other life if we find it in other systems.
A lot of your work seems to be around the understanding of the human body and how it adapts, evolves, and reacts to being in space. But I'm sure you've got a lot of thoughts on uh, transhumanism. So as we become more and more connected to machines, not just our smartphones, but things like neural implants and becoming cyborgs almost. Do you think that is inevitable if we're to become a multiplanetary species? Do you think that the first explorers that go beyond Mars are gonna have to be part machine?
Not necessarily, although I think an embrace of machine components and hybrid, even molecular machines, like making hybrid cells that can do distinct functions that we weren't born with, that's just a smaller version of other enhancements. So I think it definitely should be embraced as long as it's effective and safe and useful, of course. But I think we'll need as much help as we can get from microbes, from machines, from algorithms. All those will have to come to help us out, I think, because it's going to be a hard journey for sure. So with open arms, including maybe multiple cybernetic arms, I embrace it. Yes.
Can you say what more details on the projects you're involved in at the moment? Like this week, for instance, what are you doing this week? Are you focusing on those private crews? What's a day in the life
Yeah.
of Dr. Mason?
It is, I wake up and I get some coffee, so it's pretty simple in the morning. There's some showering, some basic wake. I get my daughter to school usually, and but in lab it's a mixture of data analytics, meetings to go over some of the newest figures for papers we're working on, or analyses from spaceflight data or other clinical data sets. But then for example, what we're doing now is prepping. We're doing a training next week for how do you do blood draw extraction of DNA and RNA and then prep it and sequence it so we can do it in space directly from blood from astronauts for the upcoming mission. So it's astronauts coming to visit the lab to do training, to walk through these protocols that we do, routinely for patients at the hospital or for or other work in the lab, but then also to do it, for anyone can do it. Make it so it's basically a protocol that you can do it in space. You can do it if you're on the moon. So getting these protocols optimized and training some of the crews for the private missions is happening as we speak. So that's a lot of fun to walk people through these molecular protocols of how you look at your DNA and your RNA, look at your genetics and how it's changing in space.
That's so cool. You've obviously accomplished a lot in your life, and it must be very exciting. And you probably take it for granted these days. The opportunity to speak to astronauts every day and pontificate and work on projects that are going to make humanity multiplanetary. I mean, it's super exciting. But what are you most proud of? Is there a moment that sort of sticks out in your memory as being, wow, I did that?
It's a great question. So I think there's several that are some of my favorite, I guess, career moments. One of them was actually really completing all the work on the twin study and finally getting it published, and then just having a whole bolus of follow-up work that came out in 2020 that was also about the mission, and really just trying to learn as much as we can from that mission, but then using that as a bedrock for future missions. So I'm very proud of all that work, and also some awards for that, which was very nice. But I think the other thing I'm actually proud of is more on a legal side. I worked on AMP versus Myriad, which is a case that we overturned what were patents on genes. It used to be you couldn't take DNA out of your own mouth and look at your DNA if you wanted to. You'd be infringing a patent and you could get sued. But I worked as basically a fellow at the Yale Law School to help begin pushing against that and submitting declarations to the court and helping train the lawyers. And we got that overturned in the Supreme Court in 2013. So maybe actually one of my proudest moments has nothing to do with spaceflight, but has everything to do with the ability for astronauts just to look at their own DNA and do these experiments without getting sued, frankly. So I think it was, yeah, a few things like that have been some of the more proud moments, I'd say, for the career, and also getting the book out. A book is really a collection of all my hopes and dreams and what I think humanity is capable of, and so getting that into a nice form and getting it, published and out there has been great, and also the feedback's been great. So it's really something I've always wanted to coalesce my ideas and get them out there and have people think about it. So it's been wonderful to get the feedback from people.
That's amazing. Can't wait to read it. A lot of young people listen to this podcast. What advice would you give to them, especially those who perhaps are thinking of a career in genomics, interested in humans in space? What areas of specialism do you think there's more to explore and people should be thinking of? Perhaps this might be the next big, research opportunity.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of great tutorials at Gene Lab, which is a resource for all the data that's made in space from animals and other projects and experiments in space. And NASA hosts tutorials and there's data online and it's all freely available. So I think the biggest thing kids should do is, well, of course, go to meetings, attend conferences, read the literature, of course, read everything you can, but then look at some of the data sets that are online. Get familiar with coding and programming and processing data. Learn the protocols that are being used in flight. Again, a lot of that's in the literature. And sometimes you can do a summer rotation project. You can even do a lot of it remotely these days by Zoom and just begin to dive into the data of which there's now
Mm.
copious amounts online. And GeneLab's probably the best place for non-human data. A lot of the human data is not yet really publicly available. We're working to fix that with some of the commercial crews that we can release that data, hopefully by the end of this year or shortly thereafter. So I'd say dive into the data is the best way to learn about the logistics of spaceflight, the parameters, the protocols, and yeah, and don't be afraid to bug people and then bug them again because everyone's really busy, and the only way anything gets done is you keep on things that you want to get accomplished. Even if someone says, "Oh, can we talk later? I'm busy." So it's okay, fine. Just be tenacious. Don't give up, I'd say.
That's brilliant advice. Thank you so much. Just before you go, I do ask most people this. I think I know the answer. Would you want to go to space? But I'm going to ask you. I'm going to assume that the answer would be yes. Um,
Yeah.
what? Yes. What would you do? Are there certain things you'd want to experiment on yourself or experience? What do you think? What would be your motivation to want to go to space? And would you be up for going to Mars or just the 15-minute low Earth orbit, high frills, up and
Uh,
down?
Yeah, I'd love to do, an orbital or interplanetary flight. I think so. I definitely would love to go. I want to make a bit so I'm a little older when I go. So my daughter, who's now 12, that it wouldn't be as tragic if she was, say, 30 if I were to die or something. Whereas now it'd be certainly more tragic, I guess. So my family would like me to go later if or when I go. So, but I would definitely go. I would even be happy to go to Mars on a one-way trip and work there to end my career and life there to contribute towards the
Really?
expansion of humanity. Yeah, yeah, man.
Wow.
I mean, I would like others to come with me. I don't want to just leave my family, but so far they don't seem keen on it. But say I'm older, maybe I'm 70, 80, even
Mm.
90, and looking at, I don't know, 5, 10, or 20 years of the sort of closing chapter of my life, I think it'd be maybe no better way to spend it. Especially if I don't know, family's all grown or maybe deceased. Why not? I would go unquestionably.
That's incredible. I guess it goes back to what you were saying about that sort of multi-generational thinking of planting seeds that you'll never sit underneath the trees of. But I think a lot of people would
Yes.
find that really hard, that sort of return journey, not having that as an option. It could be hard. I mean, I don't know. I don't know. Well, I guess by that point you'll probably have
Yeah,
sort of VR, which is indistinguishable from reality,
yeah,
so you can travel back virtually, I guess.
that's right. Yeah, kind of feel like it's not so isolating. Yeah, I think so. So it would be, again, I would prefer to go to the Mars that has some leisure activities and cocktails, but the early days will be hard. But I think that's always been true. Think of the settlers who came across the ocean here, or explorers over the millennia, from Peloponnesian explorers to Magellan. Many people, something inherent to humans have gone out to say, well,
Mm.
let's go explore, and there they. I would argue it was much more terrifying to be Peloponnesian navigator going out to go east and not sure at all what was there. Whereas at least now we know where we're going. So I think the terror is even less pronounced than it was in prior generations.
It's a hugely exciting time, and thank you so much for giving me your time today. It's very exciting, and I appreciate everything that you do. And maybe
Thanks,
one day,
thanks.
maybe one day you'll be analysing my blood as I go to space.
And right, right, yeah, send us a sample. We'll take a look. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.